Call this meeting to order. Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Meeting number 71, Wednesday, October 18th at, 3:38 p.m. So I'd like to welcome to the committee the Honourable Scott Bryson, Honourable Karina Gould, and the Treasury Board Secretariat, Jennifer Dawson, and the Privy Council Office Representative, Alan Sutherland. Go ahead. Whoever would like to start.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm delighted to be here with you today and with your committee. I'm joined by Parliamentary Secretary Joyce Murray, as well as my colleague, Minister Gould, and as you mentioned, Jennifer Dawson from TBS. I want to thank members of the committee for your work and your consideration of issues around Canada's access to information system. As we developed these reforms, we were guided by the principle that government information belongs to the people we serve. On reste engagé à respecter ce principe.
We remain committed to this principle, which the Access to Information Act first enshrined in law in 1983.
Years later, our proposed reforms advance the original intent of that act in a way that better reflects today's technologies, policies, and legislation. And this is not a one-off exercise. Rather, we've kicked off a progressive, ongoing renewal of the ATI system, one that will protect Canada's right of access to government information well into the future. Nos efforts ont commencé.
Our efforts began over a year ago. In May 2016, we issued an interim directive that enshrined the idea of government being open by default.
Data and information are increasingly released as a matter of course, unless there are specific reasons not to do so. Il s'agit de permettre aux Canadiens.
It's about allowing Canadians to better understand how government functions and to give them the information they need to contribute to a healthier democratic society.
It is being recognized by global partners for our efforts in this area. In March, we were elected to the steering committee of the Open Government Partnership for the first time, and on September 21st, Canada agreed to take on the role of lead government chair of the OGP in 2018-2019. The OGP is a multi-stakeholder organization that brings together 75 governments and hundreds of civil society organizations, and I can tell you that as a government, we are excited to take on this leadership role for Canada over the coming 2 years as co-chair. The CEO of the Open Government Partnership, Sanjay Pradhan, called our country a beacon of openness last month in New York. Additionally, earlier this year, Canada was ranked number 2 in the Open Data Barometer Survey, which is a global assessment of how governments are using open data for accountability, innovation, and social impact. The report commented on how political will in Canada has translated into strong policy foundations on openness and transparency. A year ago, we eliminated all fees for access to information requests, apart from the $5 filing fee, and directed the release of information in user-friendly formats whenever possible. Maintenant, avec les modifications proposées.
Now, with the amendments proposed in Bill C-58, we're taking the next step.
New part of the Act relating to proactive disclosure, one that puts clearly into practice the idea of open by default. Of course, this does not absolve us of our responsibility to strengthen the request-based system. We know that the Access to Information system has been the subject of widespread and warranted criticism. That's why we're developing a guide to provide requesters with clear explanations for exemptions and exclusions, investing in tools and technology to make processing information requests more efficient, allowing federal institutions with the same minister to share request processing services for greater efficiency. And we're increasing uniform government training to get common and consistent interpretation and application of ATI rules. Mr. Chair, we're also following the guidance of this committee. on prend des mesures pour
We're moving to help government institutions weed out bad faith requests, and that puts significant strain on the system.
resources. Vexatious requests can interfere with an institution's ability to do its work and to respond to other requests. Let me be clear. We have heard the concerns expressed about how we must safeguard against abuse of this proposed measure. We need to get this right and recognize that while this new tool is needed to significantly improve the system, everything from sound policy to training to proper oversight must be done to prevent its abuse. Our proposed amendments also give the Information Commissioner new powers, including for the first time the power to order the release of government records. This is an important advancement that was first recommended by a parliamentary committee studying the Access to Information Act in 1987. Our government is acting on it, and Bill C-58 will change the Commissioner's role from an ombudsperson to an authority with the order-making power to order the release of government records. We're also giving the Information Commissioner's Office more financial resources to do its job. And that's just the first phase of our Access to Information modernization. Bill C-58 includes a mandatory review of the Act every 5 years. And the first review will begin no later than 1 year after this bill receives royal assent. What's more, we require that departments regularly review the information being requested under the Act. Mr. Chair, after 34 years, Canada's Access to Information system needs updating. This is going to be an ongoing work in progress. I'd like to now pass it over to my colleague, the Minister of Democratic Institutions. Merci.
Great. Thank you very much, Minister Bryson. Mr. Chair, colleagues, committee members, thank you for inviting me to appear alongside my colleague, Minister Bryson, to address Bill C-58. I'd like to acknowledge that Al Sutherland from Democratic Institutions is here, and I want to acknowledge the important work of the public service for putting this bill together. Le gouvernement prend des mesures pour maintenir l'ouverture.
The government is taking action to ensure that our democracy continues to be open, transparent, and accountable. To accomplish this, we've introduced legislation, Bill C-33, to increase voter participation and improve the integrity of our electoral system.
Bill C-50, which would make political fundraising more transparent. As Minister of Democratic Institutions, I have also acted to help protect our electoral system from cyber threats. Plus tôt cette année, j'ai demandé au
Earlier this year, I asked the Communications Security Establishment to conduct the first ever threat assessment of Canada's democratic process. Since the release of the report in June, the CSE has reached out to political parties as well as the provincial and territorial chief electoral officers to offer them information on how they can protect themselves from cyber attack.
To discuss C-58. This legislation includes long overdue amendments to an access to information law that has not been updated since it passed almost 34 years ago. The amendments to the Act being brought forward by my colleague Minister Bryson will help to significantly update and improve how Canada's access to information laws function. I would like to focus right now in particular on how Bill C-58 will impact 3 areas. They are the offices of the Prime Minister and his ministers, members of Parliament and senators, and the administrative institutions that support Parliament and parliamentarians. Le projet de loi exigerait que le cabinet.
The bill would require the Prime Minister's office and ministerial offices to proactively disclose a range of documents. This includes mandate letters, transition binders, briefing packages for ministers and their deputies, as well as travel and hospitality expenses for ministers and their exempt staff.
Disclosure of contracts over $10,000. Information prepared by departments for question period and parliamentary committee appearances would also be subject to the Act. Comme vous le savez, certaines de ces renseignements.
As you know, some of this information is already proactively disclosed by ministers' offices. However, the practice is inconsistent and not enshrined in law. What the bill requires is uniform disclosure across all offices. It will, for the first time, legislate and impose a requirement to disclose these documents to the public. Of course, exemptions and exclusions under the Act will still apply when there are certain requests relating to issues such as personal matters or national security.
Also extends the Act to senators and members of Parliament. For the first time, this disclosure will be formalized in law. Bill C-58 also applies to institutions that support Parliament. I'm referring to organizations like the Library of Parliament, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and the Senate and Commons administrations. Nous améliorerons l'ouverture de ces bureaux, mais protégerons la...
This will protect the security and the privileges of parliamentarians. Bill 58 allows us to attain an important step in the balance of moderating the law on access to information. Democratic institutions of Canada will thus be transparent and balanced.
58 will significantly advance the availability and efficiency of the Access to Information Act as it is related to the Prime Minister's Office and Ministers' offices, parliamentarians, as well as the institutions that support Parliament. The reforms proposed in C-58 are an important step in the ongoing review and modernization of the Access to Information Act, and I look forward to working with all members to enhance accountability. And with that, I welcome your questions. Merci.
Thank you for that. First question goes to Mr. Erskine Smith.
Thank you very much, Ministers. Our committee, as you know, issued a report to recommend that the Act apply to ministers' offices, and it was a platform commitment as well. And it's great that we have proactive disclosure, and I think that's an important step. But perhaps you could explain to this committee why we don't see other provisions of the Act applying to ministers' offices, and what were the considerations that you were looking to in making that decision.
Sure. So thank you very much for the question. So it should be stated that ministers' offices and the Prime Minister's office will fall under the Act with this legislation. For the first time, we are legislating the proactive disclosure, and even though this was a practice that began under Prime Minister Martin and continued, we're expanding what is considered to be documents that will be required to be proactively disclosed. One of the key things that will be disclosed are mandate letters, for example, and that's required by legislation. Prior to this government coming into power, mandate letters were never disclosed. In fact, they were extraordinarily secretive, with really just the minister, maybe the deputy minister, and very few actual officials having access to the contents of that. This is an important step that enables parliamentarians and Canadians to hold governments to account. But furthermore, we're talking about briefing notes, transition binders, QP binders, committee binders that Canadians will have access to. And some of these, all of these things, in fact, are some of the most requested items by Canadians. So we took a look to see what are the items that Canadians are most interested in. How can we provide a more efficient system so it's more usable for the user and the person that's interested, and doing it in a way that's cost effective?
Is there a sense of, it's good that there are a number of requests that will be met with the proactive disclosure. Is there a sense of what percentage of the volume that represents?
Well, the majority of access to information requests also particularly go to Immigration and Refugee Canada. With regard to the specific numbers, I don't have that. Do you have that?
So when it comes to departmental requests, Immigration and Refugee Canada, it takes about 55% of the total.
Yeah, I meant more the extent to which proactive disclosure will lessen the current burden. Is there a sense of how much it will lessen the burden?
Nathaniel, one of the things we're looking at, and for the future we'll be guided by as a government, is as we see the volumes grow for request-based areas of information, that would be a signal to our government, and we would hope future governments as well, to move those areas into proactive disclosure, and as such reduce the burden on the request-based system. That's one of the reasons why the review every 5 years, the first one beginning within a year after this legislation receives royal assent, will enable us to observe the impact of the changes that are part of C-58, and also look at future expansion of proactive disclosure in other areas.
Since we're on the topic of proactive disclosure, the Information Commissioner has asked for authority or jurisdiction to police proactive disclosure, and I would imagine if there are redactions in relation to that material that is proactively disclosed, the Information Commissioner is looking to make sure those redactions are accurate and in accordance with the law. She says she doesn't currently have that authority as C-58 is drafted and wants it, and I wonder what you would say to her.
Well, one of the things C-58 does provide to the Information Commissioner is order-making power for the first time. In terms of the application of her authority over the proactive disclosure part of this legislation, that's something I would look forward to receiving. We would look forward to receiving the recommendation from this committee. Okay. We're open to recommendations from the committee on some of the parts of this, and that could be one of the recommendations that you could consider.
To that end, there were a few smaller items that the Commissioner had noted as well. One was Section 6, the requirement to she had a few different concerns, but the real concern, I think, was requiring that the type of record be specified, and that would actually, rather than create more openness and transparency, actually be a drawback and more limitations for requesters. And I wonder if there's an openness to addressing that concern of the Information Commissioner.
There's again, she made a number of recommendations, and in some cases they require a clarification. But in terms of areas where the committee sees we could strengthen the legislation, we do have an interest, and we look forward to hearing from the committee. Again, we do not want requests rejected, by departments or agencies. And we want, if in fact there are legitimate requests, and we want to ensure that some area of, if a request is too general, we would hope that we could help narrow the request with the requester, and that we could in fact work to fulfill that request.
Okay, I have a minute left, so I think I'll return, to my first question in relation to the rationale for not expanding access as broadly as it could be. We heard testimony on both sides in the course of our committee study. I think the majority of testimony that we heard suggested it should be extended further, but there were countervailing considerations, and I wonder if I recognize proactive disclosure is important, and certainly an important step forward given decades of inaction from a number of different governments, but I still wonder what the rationale would be for not extending the Act as it was understood before we added proactive disclosure to ministers' offices.
So again, thank you for recognizing that this is an important step forward, and it is something new that's happening and that will be in legislation. As the Supreme Court has decided previously, there is importance to having space for cabinet confidence as well, and so that's one area that is really important to ensure that there is opportunity for frank policy advice that is given to ministers to make those decisions. And it was the case of Babcock versus Canada in 2002, and the court said the process of democratic governance works best when cabinet members charged with government policy and decision making are free to express themselves around the cabinet table unreservedly. And so we do think it's important for Canadians to have more access to information, and with the items that are being proactively disclosed, it will provide a much greater access to the information that ministers are using to make decisions. But there is that important space for decision making that we think should continue.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Next up, MP Kent. 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, ministers, for appearing with us today. The same week that we began debate on C-58, the Commissioner issued an extraordinary document titled Failing to Strike the Right Balance on Transparency. And I'll just very briefly read into the record a couple of paragraphs from her opening statement. She goes into great detail in the rest of the report. The Commissioner said, in short, Bill C-58 fails to deliver. The government promised the bill would ensure the Act applies to the Prime Ministers and Ministers' offices appropriately. It does not, she writes. The government promised the bill would apply appropriately to administrative institutions that support Parliament and the courts. It does not, she writes. The government promised the bill would empower the Information Commissioner to order the release of government information. It does not, she writes. And the final line that I'll quote to you here today, Ministers, is the most telling. The Information Commissioner of Canada writes, rather than advancing access to information rights, Bill C-58 would instead result in a regression of existing rights. Minister Bryson, could you respond?
Sure, if you don't mind, Mr. Kent, I'll start, if that's okay, and then I'll pass it off to Mr. Bryson. I do want to point out that in her 2015 report, Striking the Right Balance, when it comes to ministers' offices and the Prime Minister's office, she also notes that there should be a dividing line between a minister's departmental and non-departmental functions. And with regards to the application to administrative bodies in that same report, she also notes that there has to be room and space for parliamentary privilege. And really what we tried to do with this legislation and this update to the Access to Information Act is to strike that balance to ensure that we're providing for parliamentary privilege, as all of you know as members of Parliament, is extraordinarily important so that you can exercise your functions in an independent manner. And the same thing with regards to ministers' offices and the Prime Minister's office.
Thank you,
Karina. Mr. Kent, C-58 for the first time provides the Commissioner with order-making power. The first time that was called for by a parliamentary committee was 1987. We're the first ones to actually provide that. It does provide, and for the first time, and it was actually in 87, when a parliamentary committee called for the application of the Access to Information Act to ministers' offices. We do, through an act of proactive disclosure. And for the first time ever, we're actually applying it beyond that. I mean, even to the administrative offices supporting the courts and to Parliament. But beyond that, Peter, we've known each other quite a while. The Conservatives actually committed to this in your platform in 2006 to modernize the Access to Information Act. And you had 10 years to do it, and when asked in the final days of your government why it wasn't done, Tony Clement said, well, we didn't get around to it. We're doing this in the first 2 years of our government. And beyond that, Peter, your government was the first government to be found in contempt of Parliament for not providing information to Parliament.
Minister, the time is short for my questions.
First government in the history of the Commonwealth, in fact. And I'm saying we're actually acting on this, and this is significant advancement.
Minister, with respect, you promised to be different. You offered transparency. And with regards to proactive disclosure...
We're actually keeping our promise.
Well, you've certainly disappointed the Information Commissioner of Canada. But with regards to the proactive disclosure provisions in C-58, which is something of a switch and bait, I think, in terms of what it qualifies, it is actually a false opening, or a false promise to the opening of ministerial offices. Remember, the Liberal campaign promise was to ensure that access to information applies to the Prime Minister's office and ministers' offices, as well as administrative institutions that support Parliament and the courts. The proactive disclosure provisions don't come anywhere close to that, and compounding that broken promise are the conditions involving requests for information that your government may determine to be frivolous or vexatious. The experts are unanimous in these criticisms, not only the Information Commissioner.
In terms of the frivolous and vexatious clause, and that's important because it was called for by a parliamentary committee, by this committee, and in fact by the Information Commissioner. I understand in her report she has suggestions as to ways we can strengthen that, and I'm open to those suggestions. Let's be very clear. There are bad faith requests.
Sure.
There are, within the system, there are in fact some cases where people are requesting
information on their ex-spouses who are public servants in terms of their work schedules, that sort of thing. Those are bad faith requests. This committee and the Information Commissioner have called for frivolous and vexatious clause to help address those and help take some of the gum out of the system for truly bad faith requests. Our government wants to ensure that that is not abused by departments and agencies, and we would be interested in the guidance of this committee as well as the guidance of the Information Commissioner and how we can do that, and including having her role strengthened in terms of the determination of what is or what is not a bad faith request.
With regards to the aspect of Bill C-58 that does give the Commissioner the authority to order disclosure from government departments, it also prevents the Commissioner from doing it if cabinet confidences or cabinet confidence can be invoked. And all of the access to information experts in Canada in different provincial situations say that that represents the biggest black hole of access to information in C-58.
Well, Mr. Kent, in terms of cabinet confidence, as my colleague Minister Gould has referred to the Babcock versus Canada case, Supreme Court, 2002, the court was clear the process of democratic governance works best when cabinet ministers charged with government policy and decision-making are free to express themselves around the cabinet table unreservedly. You've been a minister and understand the importance of that. And that's a principle that we will adhere to. But by the same token, we are taking steps to strengthen the Access to Information Act, to give real order-making power to the Commissioner. The way it would work is if a government, if she issues an order, if her office issues an order demanding that a government department provides information, the department has 30 days to challenge her order. And if they do that, the decision will be made by a court. They either provide the information or they would challenge the order, and a judge would make the ultimate decision. You've been a minister, and you know that a department or an agency is going to be reticent about challenging her order and ultimately the decision being made by a judge unless there is some good reason. This is a significant advancement in terms of her authority.
Yeah, we're at time. Next question, 7 minutes to MP Cullen.
Thank you very much, Chair. Welcome, ministers. So, Mr. Bryson, if I were, let me start the question this way. Do you think there's ever been times where that advice to minister has ever been abused? In the sense that someone doesn't want something ever to get out, a piece of information, all you have to do is present it to minister as advice, and it's not ever disclosed. Is that right? It's just under the current rules?
There are provisions for cabinet confidences and advice to ministers. In part, that is based on the ability and wanting to preserve the ability for public servants to be able to speak freely to ministers.
As you just said to Mr. Kent, when you provide advice to minister, it's no longer captured by access to information. You can't. The Canadian public will never see it. You and I have talked about this. This is why I'm asking Mr. Bryson a question, is because he and I have spoken about this. That if government is feeling a little under pressure, or they know there's some information that if we're ever to get out would be bad for them politically, let's say, one way to shield it is to give it as advice to minister, advice to cabinet.
May I just add? The matter of advice to cabinet is an exclusion. So that is something that is not subject to the Act. The advice to a minister is an exemption, and so there is discretion that can be applied by the institution in terms of the release of that information. So advice to minister is not universally
you heard my question, though.
Disclosure.
Has it ever been misused? And I think Mr. Bryson would be more comfortable answering it than perhaps you might be. If the suggestion is that using, as Mr. Kent referred to it, and all the experts come before us and say, when a reporter is going after a question, something that's sensitive. One way governments in the past, there's two ways. You can post-it note it, as some previous Liberal governments did at certain sponsorship time. You put a post-it note on, don't write it down. You can take it off later. Another way is to provide advice to ministers in that they are no longer subject to this. Here's the, I guess this becomes a question of who to believe. I have the Information Commissioner here, who says that previous committees that sat around this table and looked at the Act made recommendations, as did the Commissioner. You ignored those recommendations in this new C-58. I'm not sure it's really time to pop the champagne corks when the Commissioner says this bill would instead result in a regression of existing rights.
So if you don't mind, I'll jump in here because so advice that's provided by the public service to ministers is subject to the Act. It could be redacted if there are issues of cabinet confidence within that, but that is already part of the Act, and I think that that's an important thing. Of course, it's redacted for personal information, and it's redacted for anything that may be considered of cabinet confidence or international defense.
So you made the argument earlier that this already captured in this disclosure is the vast. I don't know if you put a number. You couldn't put a number to it, but you said a lot of the requests already. We're going to just disclose. Well, what government discloses are the things they want to disclose, the things that they're comfortable being out. The whole point of access to information is that there are times, as you both well know now, there are things that are uncomfortable for the government to release. So why not apply this Act, as you promised to do? I'm looking at your website. We will make government information more accessible. This is the Liberal platform.
Yes.
We both promised this one. It's in your mandate letter, too, I believe, Scott.
Well, there's a reason you can quote my mandate letter is because we proactively
Congratulations, but why is quoting it so helpful? Maybe funny. Why is quoting your mandate letter so helpful if you're actually following your mandate letter?
We were the first federal government to actually publish our mandate letters, which is why you're able to
Are you
quote
congratulating yourself for publishing a mandate letter that you're not actually following? Because in your mandate letter you say you will go forward and present a bill that will open up the Prime Minister's office and Minister's office to access information, and you're not.
And it
actually,
is because
if
for the
you-
first time in legislation, we are legislating proactive disclosure for many different items.
Hold on. We will ensure that the
information.
Access to Information Act applies to the Prime Minister's office and Ministers' offices. Are you doing that?
Yes.
How?
Yes, we are actually proposing a modern Access to Information Act that actually combines proactive disclosure and a request-based system to ministers' offices. And Mr. Cullen, I know why you're uncomfortable with proactive disclosure.
Am I?
You were uncomfortable with proactive disclosure
Am I?
when you were in the NDP and at a time when the Liberal Party was in opposition, and our Prime Minister made our party the first to proactively disclose expenses, and it was the NDP who were opposed to that.
Why I would
and
suggest
were dragged
caution-
kicking and screaming to actually proactively disclose their expenses.
I would suggest caution on this, Mr. Bryson, is I have an access to information request into the Finance Minister's Department that was rejected this summer, July 10th, in fact, where access to information request was made of Mr. Morneau's personal holdings. His department, that would not change under any of the changes you've made here today, not only denied the access to information request, said that there was no records whatsoever of even the request of access to information. This is going into the dark ages where you say, we see this, his department sees no access to information request existing at all. Well, that's a new one for me, where you not only deny the access to information, you deny the request even exists, even though it was filed with his department. So my question is this. I have a specific question with limited time. You say that if something is deemed in bad faith, who decides what's bad faith?
Ultimately, the Information Commissioner can actually act as per this legislation.
That if something is
vexatious, and there's an appeal process whereby she can actually have a role.
I'm asking for the initial determination. If I write into the Finance Department, into your department, and ask for an access to information, who is it that decides that access to information request is bad faith or vexatious? Is it the Information
Ultimately,
Commissioner?
a decision can be appealed to the Information Commissioner.
Come on, Scott, answer the question. If I ask your department for access to information, and it is denied and it is deemed bad faith, vexatious, any of those things, who makes the determination? I'm asking a simple question. Who makes the determination?
There is a role for the Information Commissioner through an appeal process. If this committee believes that role ought to be at the front end of the process, we are open to that.
I asked you 3 times now for a very specific example and a very specific. You keep referring to the ultimate appeal process, which sometimes might need court.
I actually just said, Nathan, you could take yes for an answer. I'm saying that we would be open to actually providing the commissioner with a different role in this.
You didn't put it into this legislation.
And actually, that's because we have respect for the work of committees. And if this committee has guidance that they want to provide us, we don't operate committees like branch plans of ministers' offices.
The Ethics Committee already did make that recommendation recommendation to you, Minister. The previous committee who studied this act said it should apply to the minister's offices, and the determination of vexatious or bad faith.
Nathan, I'm telling you, I actually am open to this.
That's
we
wonderful.
are open to this, and we respect the work of committee. So
I look forward to it.
absolutely,
Yeah.
look
That
forward to
is
that.
time. Next up, MP's 7 minutes. MP Seni.
Give Nathan more time. I can-
Just felt longer.
Now get ready for the tough questions.
Good afternoon, Ministers. Thank you very much for coming. And I want to go off on what Mr. Kent and what Mr. Cullen has said. I mean, we know that, part of the reason or the access information regime to work, we got to make sure that the system is working properly, and those who are tasked with providing the information are able to focus on the legitimate access to information requests by also avoiding those that are maybe pursued for other reasons and may bog down the system. So how, we got to be absolutely certain that legitimate requests are not discarded in the process, or the power to discard them isn't abused. Can you explain what safeguards will be put in place to ensure this doesn't happen? And also, can you describe what the usual process is to help ensure that people get the information they actually want, even when their initial request might not be clear or missing information?
Thanks, Raj. First of all, there are genuinely bad faith requests, and I think we understand this. The Commissioner understands this. This committee understands it. We want to make sure that no government abuses the frivolous and vexatious clause of this, and we are open to suggestions as to how to strengthen it. Let's keep in mind that 8 provinces and 3 territorial governments have similar clauses in their legislation, in their Access to Information Act, because this is an important issue. These bad faith requests do gum up the system. This committee has in fact called for this type of approach as well, and so we are currently, there is a process in this legislation whereby somebody who doesn't believe their request is in fact frivolous and vexatious, where they can appeal to the Commissioner. The Commissioner has sought more of a front-end role in the process, and we are open to that. So I'd be interested in the guidance of this committee.
So normally, most normal legislation is reviewed within a 5-year period, but this one, your ministry has put in a special case where you want it reviewed in 1 year. So can you explain why this 1-year review that you put into the bill, and what do you hope to gain within 1 year's time?
Well, first of all, the Access to Information Act, by putting into this legislation a mandatory 5-year review, that will ensure that the Act never becomes as out of date as it is today, 34 years after it was first introduced. We believe that after 1 year of this bill receiving royal assent, we will have a better understanding of what some of the changes in C-58 to the Act, some of the differences those changes have affected. And it will help inform future changes. We will have a better idea of some of the impacts of the changes, including some of what we intend on doing in terms of strengthening the technology and the resources and the training. We are committed as a government to a more efficient and responsive access to information regime. One that is consistent with open and transparent government. We will have a better idea after 1 year of this bill receiving royal assent as to what other changes we can make to strengthen it, to further strengthen it. But the Access to Information Act and regime ought to be an evergreening process that our government and future governments on an ongoing basis look to ways to strengthen access to information regime for the Government of Canada. And I think we'll learn more, and also technologies change and approaches change, and we can learn from other governments. That's part of our role as a co-chair of the Open Government Partnership, that we are learning from and sharing best practices with other countries as well.
So prior to this bill, the current model was the ombudsperson model, which put unreasonable demands on the requesters for information and also to seek judicial redress from the government. One thing that we heard during the study of this bill is we heard different types of system, and one of the systems that we heard more profoundly about was for the system in Newfoundland and Labrador, which has a hybrid model. So why did you feel that the change was necessary, and why do you feel that the hybrid model would be the best to pursue?
Sure. Well, the commissioner has not had order-making power in the past, and Raj and Nathan actually brought up a specific example. If a requester of information felt that a request was being refused inappropriately, order-making power would enable the commissioner to demand that a particular piece or request be fulfilled by the department, and the department would have 30 days to either provide the information or to challenge the order in court. And I can tell you that departments and agencies aren't going to do that unless they believe very strongly that they can defend their decision in court. That does raise the bar, and it gives her real authority.
Do you have any more time?
Yes, 1.5 minutes.
1.5 minutes. So just to follow up to that point, one of the things that we heard during committee testimony were there were some witnesses that complained that in some cases their request for information took a very long time, sometimes, weeks, months, in some cases, years. And clearly we know that with the model that we have right now, it's not working. So these new powers that we're going to give to the Information Commissioner, do you find that that this will help not only provide an opportunity for information to be received in a more timely manner?
There's a question. I mean, first of all, we are still working with the system we inherited from the previous government. We hope that this legislation will help address some of the challenges. There are issues around resources. We need to make sure that the Commissioner's office is properly resourced, and the departments and agencies are resourced in terms of being able to fulfill requests, and that they have the right technology and the platforms, and that we provide more uniform training across government departments and agencies. This is going to, what we're proposing in this legislation will make a difference, and I hope we see an improvement in terms of the responsiveness of departments and agencies to ATIP requests, and we will be working to ensure that. We want to take very much a service focus to access to information and to make it more responsive. But again, we believe we will know more as we see what the impact of some of these reforms, and they will help, that information will help inform future changes. And there's a lot to be done, both in terms of the operations and the scope of the legislation. But we're committed to making it work better for Canadians.
And that's time.
Thank you.
Sandy. Next up for a 5-minute round is MP Gord.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à tous les témoins qui sont ici, aux deux ministres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the both witnesses. I know that you have very busy schedules, and we thank you for having appeared here today. Now, if we're taking a look at frivolous or vexatious requests, it's a rather broad concept, and there's nothing in the law itself that allows us to narrow it down. The bureaucrat might decide that, well, they don't believe that it's worthwhile considering, and it would slow down the access to information process. So how are they going to go about deciding whether or not it is frivolous and vexatious? Frivolous, let's say. First of all, it's very important to avoid any abuse of process. And I think the Commissioner would be in agreement with that. We have to avoid abuse of the system. We will have to put in a proper control or surveillance protocol or etiquette, if you will, so that it is not abused. We're quite open to the advice of the committee on how to reinforce the principle. and the work of the committee. Well, in order to arrive at a concept, you'd have to you might have an idea of how many you added this provision in the law. There must have been a reason. What's the percentage of frivolous and vexatious requests? Well, first and foremost, it was a recommendation of this committee from the past, in the past, and a recommendation that we received from the office of the commissioner as well. 8 provinces, 3 territories encompass the same provision in their law. We're not the first government to propose it. There are significant reasons to include this type of provision. Once again, it's very important for us to implement a surveillance or a control mechanism to ensure that the measure will not be abused. We share the principle and the belief of open access, and we've been following the advice of the committee on that score to respect the principle. Well, I understand your answer, Mr. Minister, but in order to arrive at this measure, on 100 requests, how many have been judged either frivolous, vexatious, or inadmissible? So 1 on 5, 1 on 100, 20 on 100? I'm not sure that we actually have statistics of that nature, but perhaps Jennifer might be able to contribute. We've taken a look at the statistics available to us. And in regards to frivolous requests, less than 1% of requests are deemed to be frivolous or treated as if they were frivolous. It's less than 1%. All right. So, if that's the case, it still it appears in the law for a less than 1% basis. Well, yes. It could be less than 1% of the total of requests, but that could still represent a quantum that is quite a stress on the system. The reality is that of these requests would be vexatious as well. And it could be onerous to the system. They could be asking for a huge amount of information with one request, and it could be quite a lot of work represented there. But as it is not actually a part of the system now, to monitor the system, it'll be a new feature of the eventual evaluation made of it when the time comes to review the Act. Time remaining? Perfect.
5 minutes and 6 seconds. So next up, next 5-minute round to Ms. Fortier, 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Bon après-midi.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having appeared this afternoon before us. We know you're busy. I'm very, very pleased to see that we're actually making a moving on this issue today, and you've worked quite hard on this bill. We'll be studying it at the committee for a while now. As was mentioned earlier, this was in fact an electoral commitment, and in my riding during the by-election, certain questions arose. 6 months ago, I was discussing door-to-door, and people wanted to see some action on this issue, and I'm glad to see that we're moving ahead today. So thank you for that. I'd like to understand the rationale why it took so much time to get to where we are today to introduce this new process, a statutory review of the law. How come it took so long to get here? Thank you very much, Mona. It's certainly not an easy issue for any government. And this is why perhaps we are the first government in over 30 years to attempt and to start the modernization of this law. We're the first government to provide order-making authority to the Commissioner for Information. That is a significant progress. The first to include the Prime Minister's and Ministers' offices in the law. That's progress. And for the first time, the law will apply to over 240 federal agencies. That is progress. We will continue to raise the bar for greater transparency and accountability, and in future, particularly as we have these mandatory 5-year reviews, that we will continue to improve and progress with our government and future governments. It's unacceptable to have a Modernization Act after 34 years. It's not acceptable. That's far too long. So it was very important to us, while in opposition and now in power, to continue to ensure progress and improvement and deliver on that improvement to our citizens, to make government more open and more transparent.
Oh, probably, Mr. Chair, my time is running out, but I still have another quick question. There has been a lot of conversation in the media and in the public about two very specific parts of this legislation. And firstly, the order-making powers given to the Access to Information Commissioner, and secondly, the ability for departments to rule a request as frivolous and vexatious. We've been talking about this. Can you explain why these two sections are important to the Access to Information legislation and system?
Firstly, on the frivolous and vexatious part of this legislation, this was called for by this committee and, in fact, by the Commissioner. And it does reflect a reality that we do have bad faith requests that gum up the system and don't serve Canadians well. We want to make sure this does not get abused. And it's important to realize that 8 provinces and 3 territories have similar clauses in their legislation. There is a provision in the legislation where the Commissioner has a role through an appeal process. If there are ways we can strengthen her role, we are open to that. I know she has, in her report, sought a strengthening of her role, and this is something to which we are open as a government. I look forward to the committee looking at that as one of the areas. And in terms of order-making power, if somebody seeking information and refused information appeals to the Commissioner, she can order that information or that department to provide the information, and the department has 30 days to either provide the information or to actually challenge her order. Ultimately, the decision being made by a judge. Again, I would assert that a department or agency is not going to challenge an order of the Information Commissioner in a court unless they have some level of certainty as to their arguments and the legitimacy of their arguments. That would be something I expect will not be done frivolously.
Thank you. Next and last question goes to MP Kent.
Thank you, Chair. Ministers, I began my questions referring to what the Information Commissioner has characterized in her response to C-58 as failing to strike the right balance for transparency. And Chair, I'd just like to table for the record in both French and English the Information Commissioner's report. And in that report, it's interesting that she concludes by doing a very basic grade of Bill C-58 with passes and fails. She found that 5 elements of C-58 are positive. She found that 15 elements of Bill C-58 are, in fact, regressive. Could you respond to that?
I guess there's a reason why no government has ever actually fulfilled its promise to modernize the Access to Information Act until we came along, because it's not easy and it's hard to please everybody. What I would say to the Commissioner is that this does provide her with order-making power for the first time ever. In fact, 30 years after a parliamentary committee first sought or recommended order-making power. This does apply the Act to ministers' offices for the first time ever. This does apply, in fact, to 240 governmental organizations, and including the courts. This is a significant progress. Now, there may be individuals and organizations that are not totally satisfied with what we've proposed. By having a mandatory 5-year review, we can consider further improvements in the future. And I want to remind the committee that we are open to amendments from the committee that can strengthen the legislation. And this is really important legislation, and your work at this committee at this critical point of modernizing Access to Information Act is historic and important. So we can't please everybody all the time, but we are acting to actually strengthen the Access to Information Act.
Well, if the time is short, and I know that you're about to make your departure, but you spoke earlier to respect for this committee's recommendations, most of which you've ignored from a year ago and which are still before us again, and I suspect will be recommended in our response after committee study. But you also spoke positively of your commitment to open government. This committee recommended a year ago that in the first phase of the reform of the Access to Information Act, the Act be amended to include a general public interest override applicable to all non-mandatory exemptions, with a requirement to consider the following non-exhaustive list of factors: open government objectives with environmental, health, or public safety implications, or whether the information reveals human rights abuses or would safeguard the right of life, liberty, or the security of the person. That recommendation, like so many of the others, was ignored. Your comment?
Again, Peter, giving the commissioner order-making power is a significant step forward. That has not been done before. Applying it to ministers' offices and to Parliament and to the administrative branches supporting the courts is a significant step. We have, in this legislation strengthens the Act. We are open to amendments. We will consider those amendments as a government. But beyond that, in a year from this bill receiving royal assent, there will be the first mandatory review. That will lead to this coming back to this committee. And we will have an understanding of what these changes have made, what difference these changes have made. And that can inform this committee and our government. And every 5 years, this will actually lead, as we make successive changes in an evergreening process, we will learn from those and we will be able to strengthen this. We're proceeding in good faith, Peter. Okay. And we are committed to strengthening this act. And it may not go as far as some people want it to go now, but there may be some other groups who are concerned that it goes too far in certain areas. And, you know, I believe you're going to be meeting with the Privacy Commissioner at some point here. And there's a balance between privacy, for instance, and access to information. And in most provinces, I believe the Privacy and Access to Information Act office are actually in the same branch. But those are, as a government, we seek a balance between those factors, and we will defend both.
Well, in thanking...
I would just say very quickly,
sure.
Within the Information Commissioner's report, she does acknowledge that there are steps forward, and particularly with regards to ministers' offices and prime ministers' offices with regards to proactive disclosure. And so we we did really try to find a balance here, and I think for an act that's being updated for the first time in 34 years, as Minister Bryson mentioned, within a year's review, we're going to be able to see how this has changed. And one thing that I think is important to note and to look for is how it enables citizens to access information in a more timely, efficient manner in a way that they wouldn't have had it before. Because right now the burden is on them to specifically request information, whereas they will have a more holistic view.
Well, if I could
of this
thank you both
information.
for your appearance before us today, and we'll continue, of course, with the officials. A great deal of time could be saved in the review process if the government would accept the recommendations not only of this committee, but the recommendations of the commissioner herself.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We're at time, and I'd like to thank Ministers Bryson and Minister Gould for appearing to committee today, and thanks for spending some time in your busy day here. We'll just adjourn, we'll suspend until we can have the new witnesses come and get seated. Thank you. Bring the meeting back to order. We still have quorum, so we're going to keep going. So I'd like to welcome to committee today I just would ask if there's conversations, if you could just step outside, please, and have those conversations if you have to, if you'd be so kind. So I'd like to welcome the Treasury Board Secretariat, Jennifer Dawson, Deputy Chief Information Officer, Ruth Naylor, Executive Director, Information and Policy Division, Chief Information Officer Branch, the Privy Council Office, Alan Sutherland, and the Department of Justice, Derek Crosby, and Sarah Gee. Is that correct? Gay?
Stephanie.
And, sorry, Stephanie Vig as well. I would like to say to our members, there's no opening statements by the officials. It's just we're going to go straight to questions. So first up, question, 7 minutes to Mr. Erskine Smith.
Okay. Well, first, thanks very much. I have some more technical questions, which I'd like to get through. First, just to follow up on proactive disclosure, I was asking the ministers, and it would be good to have a sense of, and if you don't have an answer now, that's okay. Hopefully you can get it for us, but the percentage of existing requests in relation to ministers' offices that the proactive disclosure would address. That would be useful for I think, our consideration.
Yeah, so in response to that, the proactive disclosure that will be applied to ministers' offices and the Prime Minister's office is a new provision. And so we don't have, we would not have an existing comparison in terms of requests to ministers' offices that we could align to the proactive disclosure requirement.
Okay, fair enough. I think it was Minister Gould who said it would be a large proportion, so that was what I was building that question off of. But if we don't have the numbers, we don't have the numbers.
To add to that, what Minister Gould was speaking to was the fact that we know that people are interested to receive this type of information.
Right.
So, for example, in the proactive publication of briefing notes, this is something that's been done as a best practice at Treasury Board Secretariat without existing policy. And what we found is that requesters do come back regularly to then follow up with specific requests for briefing notes. So we know that it's been tested and has been facilitating.
When it comes to the question of order-making powers, so the Information Commissioner has expressed some concern about in a situation where a department neither follows through on the commitment within the 30 days to release the information and also doesn't go to court to appeal. And in that situation, the commissioner has said, there is a difficulty perhaps with enforcing the order, and she's asked for an easy certification process, presumably something like after the 30-day period is expired, one can easily just over the counter with the registrar certify the order as an order of the court. And perhaps you could speak to, is that a good idea? Is that something we should consider? And if not, why not?
Our intention in the way that the bill is worded is actually that we would not require that additional step. That in fact her order does have the weight of a court order, and if her order was not being followed, that she would be able to seek mandamus. So in other words, an order to enforce the order directly without having to ask for certification first. So that's our intention with the bill.
And is there something in the legislation that we can point to give comfort to the commissioner when she's here before us?
As I understand it, this is the order-making power does have the force of statute. So it's not explicitly written within the Act, but in fact it's inherent to the bill.
Okay. Perhaps when we have the CBA in front of us, we can get into the nuts and bolts of that, which takes me to judicial independence. So first, I think it's 90.22 in the Act. I could have it wrong, but it's in relation to the individual that expresses the concern in relation to judicial independence. And it occurs to me that it ought to be perhaps the Chief Justice of the affected court that would be the one that raises the concerns, and not an official that isn't raising and shouldn't be an official, as it were, that is raising the concern of judicial independence. And would there be an objection from the department to that recommendation?
So I can't speak to how that recommendation would be received, but I can certainly say that when the bill reflects the decision to provide the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs with the authority to determine that information
No,
disclosure.
well, obviously, I can read
Right.
9.22, and that's what it says, but it makes more sense, and so I would appreciate some feedback on this as to whether there is a reason to think otherwise. But rather than an official that isn't, it strikes me that on the question of judicial independence, it should be a Chief Justice of the affected court that is raising the concern of judicial independence. So I leave that with you. If we could get some response to that consideration, it would be appreciated. And the second thing that I couldn't figure out, I think it's at 90.25, but the Canadian Judicial Council is exempted. And I can't figure out why, if we're exempting the Canadian Judicial Council, why we wouldn't exempt courts more broadly. And so what's the rationale for that?
So the rationale for excluding the Canadian Judicial Council is that it's actually not a government institution. It's an independent statutory body that fulfills non-government functions. It has a mandate that's much broader than a government institution, and it would, no question, raise serious concerns about judicial independence.
Well, how would it raise considerations about judicial independence if this very same provisions applying to courts aren't raising those considerations?
So the provisions don't apply to the courts. The provisions apply to the Commissioner for Federal Judicial Affairs in respect of judicial expenses, and with respect to the administrative institutions that support the courts. If you're speaking of the Courts Administration Service as well as the Registry of the Supreme Court of Canada, they are government institutions, and as with the other provisions...
The CJC is funded by federal dollars, though.
Yes.
So, I mean, for the purposes of how we're, how Chief Justices, the 37 Chief Justices through the CJC are spending money, wouldn't I, as a taxpayer, be just as concerned about that as I am about how the court administration is spending money? I mean, they're all federal funds.
I'm sure Jennifer could speak to the range of bodies that are not subject to access to information, that are getting public funds. The point, though, with the CJC is that it comprises the 39 Chief Justices and Associate Chief Justices who are performing functions that are often constitutionally protected by judicial independence. So,
okay. So it's a judicial independence argument, which for some reason doesn't apply to courts as well. Okay, so when it comes to the non-legislative, so a lot of the changes at our committee when we issued our original recommendations, there were legislative changes proposed, but a larger question, and especially as requests keep increasing year after year, month after month, and the system's creaky as it is, are there any efforts underway that you could perhaps tell us about with respect to digitization, centralization, and the resources and additional resources and training of staff that you're looking at doing?
Yes, we are thinking very much about process improvements, and we're recognizing that there is that increasing pressure year over year in terms of the number of requests and the volume of material that departments are processing. One of the things that we proposed in the bill is to enable institutions that are in the same portfolio to share resources, to have shared access to information and processing units, which can be really helpful in some situations. You may have a large department that's under the same minister paired with a small department, and being able to enable the use of those resources more effectively is going to help. We're also looking at improving the access to information processing tools that departments have. So we have softwares that are used that are could do with modernization that we would really like to improve, and we really are targeting increasingly operating as a digital government and providing information in digital formats. And that's
time.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're well over.
We're on a roll.
Tried to let you finish. So next up for 7 minutes, MP Kent.
Thank you, Chair. Time ran short in the last hour, but in response to the suggestion by Minister Bryson that the Privacy Commissioner be called as a witness, I'd just like to move a motion that the Privacy Commissioner be added to our list of witnesses, along with the Information Commissioner herself. And
So we'll have,
She moved the motions because that's taking priority to all the rest.
Yeah.
So we proceed to debate and then.
yep. Okay, so we will deal with the motion on the floor right now. Any
Wants to speak?
wants to speak to it? Debate. Seeing no debate, would like to vote on the matter?
A recorded vote, please,
Recorded
Chair.
vote. All in favor?
That's what I do. Give me a second.
Just for clarity, just so I'm, the specific wording of what you're asking is just for the privacy commissioner to attend.
Be added to the list of witnesses with appropriate time for discussion before the committee, as well as the information commissioner herself.
Yeah, so the only thing I would say to that, I think we would welcome that. I didn't take issue with, I don't think anyone here took issue with him being on the list. In terms of time, do we want to specify that it be an hour?
I think an hour's fine.
I think the privacy commissioner could well speak to it. Minister Bryson seemed to give great import to what the privacy commissioner may add to the discussion, so.
Yeah, so we've got the information commissioner who is more relevant to this for 2 hours, and so I think privacy commissioner for an hour would be fair.
So the mover of the motion is MP Kent. What would you like in the motion for time for that specific witness?
I agree that given 2 hours with the information commissioner, who is actually the most relevant to Bill C-58, that an hour for the privacy commissioner would be appropriate.
In agreement? Okay, so seeing no further debate, all in favor of that motion? All opposed? Carried.
Thank you, and sorry for the delay, folks. One of the recommendations. Oh,
said.
That's correct.
I don't know.
You still, yeah, no, we'll follow through that.
I don't know. I just was.
I saw you.
Just.
It was unanimous, what I saw on the floor,
Yeah,
so.
so unanimous is.
Usually gets everybody.
You don't get better than that.
Exactly. Thank you. To the questions. Among the recommendations of this committee last year that were not implemented, specifically recommendation 23, which said that the mandatory exemptions for cabinet confidences would not apply, the committee suggested, to purely factual or background information, to information in a record of a decision made by the cabinet or any of its committees on an appeal under the Act, where consent is obtained to disclose that information, and information in a record that has been in existence for an appropriate period of time as determined by the government, and the committee said that this period be less than the current 20 years. Was there anything unworkable or inappropriate in that recommendation that the government has chosen not to include in C-58?
The focus of what has been brought forward in Bill C-58 is really strongly aligned to the government-specific mandate commitments, and that question of exclusions versus exemptions is something that can be considered in that first full review of the Act, which would be that 1 year within the royal assent of the bill. So I don't have a view to offer on that particular recommendation, but would just observe that there definitely is an intent to undertake a full review that would go much more broadly than the amendments that are proposed today.
So it's punted for later deliberation, more or less. Quite a number of experts have said of the provision of appeal to a decision made by a minister or a department that, in fact, it would be better if the appeal were made directly to the information commissioner. Again, is there a problem with a more direct appeal process and the commissioner's ruling than the courts?
I apologize. I just want to make sure I understand your question. Are you talking about in terms of a determination of whether a request could be declined to be processed because it's frivolous or vexatious, or?
Well, that's sort of a secondary question, but no, I'm talking about the original decision on cabinet confidence, or the refusal of a decision without a reason.
So I guess I would, on cabinet confidence, currently it's not subject to the Act, so it's outside of the Information Commissioner's purview. And so, again, that's something that we could be looking at in a future review of the Act, but right now it's...
But with regards of a minister or the department in refusing a request, the right of appeal directly to the Information Commissioner would seem to be logical given her authority.
So in terms of if a requester makes under the existing system, if a requester asks something from a department and isn't satisfied that it's been provided, essentially the Information Commission, they have recourse to the Information Commissioner, who can help to investigate the situation, and today has a recommendation power, and would provide that recommendation to a head of an institution to do something in that regard. The order-making power that we're proposing now would create a situation in which the requester may have concerns that they haven't received what they should. And there would be still the investigation power working with the department. There would be still a capacity for mediation and discussion among parties to try and resolve it. But ultimately, if issues couldn't be resolved, the Information Commissioner will have an order-making power. Will have the ability to issue an order that says to a department, in my view, you must release. In those very rare circumstances where an institution feels that there's something that absolutely can't be released, that it will have to go to court to demonstrate that it is on the right side of the Access to Information Act and demonstrate that it has been applying the Act appropriately.
And would the Information Commissioner's message to the department that rejection was inappropriate be privileged or public?
So that's something that we are aware that the Information Commissioner is keen to have the ability to report, and as the bill is proposed, this would be done through her annual report. She would be able to provide transparency in terms of those orders that she has issued, and her reasons and their resolution.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. I think I've taken my time. No, I'll cede.
Thank you, MP Kent. Up next, I'd like to welcome to committee Mr. MP Blakey. 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good to be back. I'm sure they're all very happy to see me. I was thinking of you when I said that, Raj. I guess one of my questions that I had around the Act. I mean, one of the big conversations that we had when we did a study of the Act was around the difference between exclusions and mandatory exemptions. Can you just explain for us whether this changes in any way the regime around exclusions in the Access to Information Act?
Correct. It doesn't. This bill does not propose to change exclusion or exemptions.
Okay. So in terms of the discussion we had, which said, that one of the main problems with having exclusions as opposed to mandatory exemptions is that you can pretty much there's no oversight at all by the Information Commissioner. Then, if government says that this is a cabinet confidence or it falls in any category that is subject to an exclusion, then there's no way to check that those are appropriately excluded, or that the government's made the right call on whether or not this is something that ought to be excluded or not.
So I'll just be repeating myself a little bit, but this set of amendments doesn't address that issue, so it's without judgment in terms of that view of the committee. There's a focused set of amendments that are in this bill, and that issue remains as something that could be addressed in the first full review of the Act, which would be within 1 year of coming into Royal Assent.
Okay. One of the other issues that jumped out for me, given some of what we had heard during our study, was the failure of this particular bill to expand the access to information regime to the Prime Minister's office and to ministers' offices. But what we've heard is that because there's going to be a new kind of proactive disclosure regime ushered in, that we ought to be happy with the changes, because this is a new era. I think the phrase might even have been used in openness and transparency. Can you just explain, for the benefit of the committee, in what ways having proactive disclosure requirements allows Canadians to get access to information that the government doesn't want to release?
Well, I think we found, in looking at the types of proactive disclosure that are included in this bill, and that do apply to ministers' offices and the Prime Minister's office, there's an alignment between the types of proactive disclosure that have been identified and information that we know is of interest. So, for example, the publication of briefing binders for deputy ministers and for ministers provides a level of information proactively that hasn't previously been available, and not only to requesters who are willing to pay their $5 and follow that process, but to Canadians in general. And so we're hoping through the proactive disclosure of these materials online in both official languages and accessible, that actually does offer a much greater transparency than there is today.
So how will ministers' offices establish what they want to proactively disclose? I mean, is there any kind of threshold for if the same kind of request or request for the same kind of information is made by a certain number of Canadians? Is there any requirement on the minister's office then to disclose that information, or is it really up to the minister's office to interpret according to its own criteria, whatever that criteria may be, what kinds of information would be subject to proactive disclosure?
So I'd say two things. Currently, there's a specific list of proactive disclosure that's proposed in this bill against a regular reporting timeline, so it'll be a predictable schedule for certain kinds of information. But there's something else that we're also looking at doing as well, which is asking institutions to do a regular review of the requests that they get so that they can use that analysis to increase proactive disclosure over time. So what we want to do is have a continuous improvement cycle. We're beginning something new, so it's a starting point, but the intention over time is to have to track the kinds of things that are being requested. As you were suggesting, many Canadians ask for a certain kind of information, and then use that information in terms of enhancing and expanding what is proactively disclosed.
But there's no way through the legislation that Canadians, by either the aggregate of their actions or by organizing collectively, that they could drive certain kinds of proactive disclosure, except as they could now by applying political pressure. But there's no legal mechanism in the Act that would make it the case that Canadians could push government to reveal certain kinds of information that they don't want to.
So you're correct. The bill doesn't legislate a responsive proactive disclosure, but I guess the other opportunity as well is if there is an ongoing review of the bill, that also provides parliamentarians with an opportunity to revisit what is in there to ensure that it is reflective.
And is there anything the government would be forbidden from proactively disclosing now that they'll be able to proactively disclose after this bill passes?
Forbidden?
Yeah, I mean, do they need to? Part of what I'm saying is, do they need to change the law to proactively disclose anything? Does the law enable some kind of proactive disclosure that's not permitted now?
I think what it does is it entrenches in legislation a requirement to proactively disclose. So you're right, it doesn't maybe you don't need a law to compel that from all governments at all times, but if parliamentarians support the bill, what it's doing is creating a legislative requirement for this and future
Does it include any
governments.
penalties for ministers' offices that aren't compliant with the proactive disclosure provisions in the legislation?
So, in terms of legislation, it's as with other legislation. If you're not complying with what the law requires, then you're outside of.
And that's one of the benefits of putting it in statute, that it's clear to everyone whether or not a minister is fulfilling the requirement that's set out for him.
That's time, MP Blakey. We'll go to another 7-minute round to Mr. Mr. Erskine Smith. Thank you.
Probably not ever. So when it comes to InfoSource, so I'm not too familiar with InfoSource, but I'm reading the special report from the OIC, and there's some concern that information that would provide Canadians with a working knowledge of how to make requests in a more efficient way has been taken down, and the response seems to be, well, it's available on the internet, on government websites otherwise. Why would we not simply provide a digital version of InfoSource, or perhaps that is the intention?
Yeah, so InfoSource, again, it's something that's associated to the Act since 1983. So originally, when it was created, that was at a point in time when each institution had a reading room. You could go to the reading room to get access to typically paper files, which would be brought to you. InfoSource was typically found in hard copy in public libraries, so it was essentially a phone directory, like the white pages that we don't use too much today. Our intention here is to recognize that departments do make available through the internet now a lot of information about their programs, but it's also linked. We have a legislated duty to assist requesters. So if they can find us and they have an idea of their request, we should and must help them in fulfilling their request.
So perhaps, I take the purpose of InfoSource was to facilitate make it easier for requesters to understand how to best go about it. And so that duty to assist is put down generally. InfoSource was a specific way to assist individuals, and I don't know what the answer is, but I think you may want to look into prescribing some more specific version of the duty to assist, and ensuring that InfoSource and the underlying purpose lives on online. So I'd asked the ministers when they were here about the rationale for not going further in applying the Act to ministers' offices, and one of the answers was cabinet deliberations. But as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Act currently there's a mandatory exclusion in relation to cabinet confidence, and there are exemptions in relation to advice and recommendations to ministers. So I don't completely understand the rationale, but perhaps you could clear up that confusion.
Yeah, so in bringing forward a proactive disclosure regime that applies now to institutions that have never been covered under the Act before, we're really trying to provide access to information that can be provided and that is of interest. And so very often it's typically the kinds of proactive disclosure that we're proposing relate, for example, to the use of public funds. And so this is a way of capturing ministers' offices and the Prime Minister's offices and the institutions that support the courts.
So maybe put it a different way, there are other jurisdictions that do have their freedom of information or access to information laws apply to ministers' offices in different ways, and there may be problems in those jurisdictions for all I know. And so when the department's looked at this and is putting this legislation forward, and the ministers put this legislation forward, are there countervailing considerations that this committee ought to be aware of as to why the government did not make the decision to apply the Act as it was understood before proactive disclosure to apply to ministers' offices?
Sorry. I think the only thing I'd like to add to the earlier part of my answer is a reminder as well that the two-step process still does apply in terms of access to information in ministers' offices. So if an institution could reasonably expect to have access to the information, for example, deputy minister might have what's in a minister's office, and it applies to the work of the department, it is subject to the request system.
The Information Commissioner has taken issue with what seems to me to be a little bit vague language in the Act, which is large number of records, and that is combined with where it might unreasonably interfere with government operations. There's got to be a better way of the idea of large number of records. I don't exactly know what that means, is this a concern that the department is looking at addressing in terms of perhaps more precise language?
So I think what the guidance and the policy guidance and the guidance and training for institutions will be really critical in this. In the provinces and territories that do have an ability to decline to process, they do provide guidance and examples to help their organizations. For us, when we're taking a look at what is so large that it impedes the ability of an organization to do its work, that's got to be context specific. There are completely legitimate requests that will be associated with a very large number of records. And one of those, for example, might be First Nations that are looking for information about their histories. There are going to be big requests, and that will need to be responded to.
Is the answer the same? So when we have the discussion about vexatious and frivolous requests, the minister's answer is, well, you know what, if the wrong determination is made, the Information Commissioner can fix that through an order. And does the same answer apply in relation to the large numbers of records?
Yes, so the authority to decline to process a request is subject to the oversight of the Information Commissioner.
So there's some comfort there for citizens to say, well, the Information Commissioner can ensure that this would be actually so voluminous that it would interfere with, and the public interest doesn't outweigh that.
That's right, and we do have a duty to assist as well. So we will be working with requesters to try and ensure that we have a good understanding of what they're looking for, so that we can help the request be of a volume we can deal with.
When it another concern, I think, of the Information Commissioner is when the order-making powers and the rules take effect. It occurs to me that we're going to enter into a strange situation where there's a certain class of cases before the Information Commissioner up to today's date and a year from now that order-making does not apply to. And then there's going to be a second class after that date, and order-making does apply. And I wonder why we wouldn't just defer to the best practices and expertise of the Information Commissioner to do as they see fit, give them order-making powers for all cases, and let them do their job.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question. Our intent in having a transition period was to avoid confusion in the system where some investigations began under one process and shifted to another. But it's something to
for them. But I leave it to them to. It might be even more complicated to have a dual system in place for an extended period of time, and we may want to have them weigh in and listen to their advice.
MP Erskine Smith. Thanks very much. Yep. Next round, 5-minute round to MP Gord.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are there any provisions, methods within departments to constrain or contain information? For example, national defense might be reluctant to divulge certain information for security, national security engines, or it might give some information on some of the procurement that the DND has entailed. It would give away some information, relevant information, to perhaps a foreign country. Are there any such provisions?
Act does include provisions to consider the protection of some information that would either be of harm to the national interest if released or of harm to individuals. And so we have not proposed any changes in terms of those existing provisions. Donc, il y a certaines qui sont à la...
Some, of course, are linked to a description by the department. The idea is to ensure that every time that this discretionary authority is exercised, there has to be a strong rationale for why the information may not be released.
Ask ourselves in those situations where we have discretion, to the greatest extent possible, how can we be open while protecting that small piece of information that must be protected? And so that's part of an education and a training and a consistency in the system that we need to continue to advance. But the last spring, or spring 2016, we issued an interim directive that reminded people of the importance of being open by default and to leaning to openness when they are making interpretations where discretion can be applied. But it's also, there is a recourse to the Information Commissioner, other than in information that is excluded, to ensure that that discretion is being appropriately applied.
Est-ce que ce recours-là
Is that recourse used from time to time? Do you have any statistics indicating how often this was the case? Yes, in fact, we do have some statistics. Each time that an exemption is triggered, we have that information. Usually, it's for personal information grounds, or national security, defense, or international affairs, or ongoing criminal investigations, for example. That information, when it concerns one individual, has to be maintained in strict confidentiality. Or those other situations which are clearly defined in the law. Thank you. That's all for me, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Gord. Next up, 5-minute round, MP Bayliss.
Welcome. I'm rather new to the committee, so my questions might be a little more general, less detailed. I was curious to understand if what's being proposed had been compared to best practices, say, in other foreign jurisdictions or what provinces are doing. Has that work been done?
So much of the, for example, the work in terms of thinking about declining to process requests has been based on taking a look at what's done in provinces and territories and talking to our colleagues in those jurisdictions.
And pulling on their expertise to see what's worked and what doesn't work?
Yes, and having a look at how their legislation is framed as well. What's different for the provinces and the territories, though, is that they typically have a single commissioner who is responsible both for access to information and privacy.
So that person is naturally inside of themselves making that balance.
That's right. And so what we're trying to ensure in the proposal that we have as well is that there, for example, in the order-making power, what we have proposed is the Information Commissioner has an order-making power, but the Privacy Commissioner, in appropriate circumstances, could be involved to ensure that the appropriate views of both commissioners are brought to bear.
And it's always that question of if you over-divulge or under-divulge, and how do you find that medium? And you're saying that the provinces, because it's all within one person's department, one person, they themselves can more easily adjudicate that, as opposed to having to
It's a different model than the federal model, but it does bring together very closely those considerations both of access to information and protection of privacy.
Now, when you start looking at something like a minister's office, or specifically the Prime Minister's office, there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to be discussed there that's clearly not meant for general consumption. Even if people think they have a right to know, there's things that they just can't know or shouldn't know. Is any of that happening in the provincial level where there's the access to information into the Premier's office?
In some jurisdictions, the records within ministers' offices are considered to be departmental records. In other jurisdictions, that's not the case.
So it depends on the jurisdiction.
Yes, it does.
What would be the dangers of, say, if or the consequences of if we're looking at something like this and we're trying to arrive at a place which is the balance between access to information and privacy, and we've got to get that right balance. There's always the concerns if we over-divulge or if we under-divulge. When these things tend to happen, I always like to err on the side of caution, which is where we've never done this, so we're going to start doing something. And if I understand correctly, this is the first time anything's going to be happening coming in from the federal government, coming out of the minister or the Prime Minister's office, in effect, this proactive disclosure. Is that correct?
That's right, and it's a pretty significant change. And you know, even earlier, Minister Gould was speaking to the publication of mandate letters, and she you know, described a situation in which bureaucrats previously working within the departments who were affected by those mandate letters really did not have exposure to them. Today, there's a public access, so there is a significant change that's here, and it's...
So these are pretty significant changes. Now, I understand some people may argue that, hey, it's not enough, and what is enough? And it's always difficult to find, when you've never been there, to find the right balance. But it is, if I understand correctly, these are fairly major changes, though arguments could be made that, hey, even more should be done.
Yeah, it's the first time that the Act is applying to ministers' offices and the Prime Minister's office, as well as the institutions that support the courts and Parliament and the Senate.
Yes. I'm normally of the belief, like I said, when you're trying, there's no exact right or wrong. Who knows what is right or wrong in this area when you're trying to find the balance? So my personal feeling would be, if we're going to make an error, let's under-divulge. Let's err on the side of caution. Always be caution, and then we can always add to it later. Is that correct?
Well, the first full review of the Act, which would take place within a year of the royal assent, would provide, in shorter than the normal 5-year cycle, an opportunity to see what is working or has begun working or is maybe not working as well as it needs to.
So it's a good step, and we can go a certain direction and come back and look at it again?
And that's why the approach that we've been taking is to bring forward a bill that focuses very specifically on some important commitments that were made, and to support the government in advancing those, but to ensure that also in the bill there is an ability for full review in short order to go further.
It also gives you a chance to look at the law of
Go ahead, finish what you...
Well, I'm just saying there's always the law of unintended consequences, so we end up trying to do something, but pretty quickly we'll have a look at it and say, hey, this is working the way we expected, or maybe it's not working, and you'll be able to capture that at that time. Is that correct?
That's the intent, is for the ongoing reviews to allow parliamentarians to have that discussion.
Thank you. Next up, Chair is going to take some discretion and ask a question of Ms. Naylor, if you're ready to answer a question. And it's with regard to the firearms registry and the earlier copy that was requested by a certain Bill Clinette. And it was concerns about, I guess, what was in that information. There was a copy of 120,000 plus pages of information, of Canadians' information, given to one individual because they simply requested it. And I guess the concern is, and it goes to what has been asked on both sides, about who decides on what's redacted, who decides in your office who gets what. And I think the concern is, and I've tried to obtain a copy of what was given to Mr. Clinette, and was told I would not be able to get a copy of what he received. The nearest I could find is that the information was redacted, but he was able to obtain postal codes of firearms owners across this country. And I guess as a concern is private information, even as a state actor on that level, to know where everybody's personal property exists in different neighborhoods around our country, I think it's alarming, to say the least, that one individual would obtain this information. But I guess getting back to the original question, who decides on what level of redaction, or who decides in your office, so what level of information is actually given out to the public? Thank you.
Just to clarify my role, thank you very much for the question. To clarify my role, I've been involved in the development of the bill, as opposed to making decisions about access to information requests. We have another unit at the Treasury Board Secretariat that is responsible for that. So I can respond in a general level to how these decisions are made. The Act, as it now stands, sets out certain discretions, but the ultimate accountability is for the head of the institution. That's delegated down generally to access to information coordinators to exercise those discretions on the part of ministers. And there's very clear guidance provided about how those discretions are to be exercised, if that helps.
Do you have a set of guidelines as a document that you could provide to committee?
We have a very large set of policies that exist right now, as well as a manual that we provide, and it's actually available online, so we can provide the information to the committee on that.
Thank you. That's all I had. We still have approximately 5 minutes. We'll go to MP Dubourg. 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. À mon tour de vous saluer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's my turn to greet you. Good afternoon. And as my colleague Frank Bailey has said earlier, very general. We know that C-38 will be dealing with protection of personal information and access to information. Whenever there's a mention of, whenever you see a document with a stamp on it saying protected or confidential or secret, do these eventually or sometimes become accessible, or what's their treatment under the bill? Classification of documents depends, of course, on the sensitivity of the content. For example, if a document is marked classified, there could be perhaps only one segment of the text, one sentence, or one paragraph, one portion of that text which has to be protected. So in such a situation, we could provide the entire document with some redaction of that particular part. Our method for redacting it, if we can share what we can share, we will share, except for what has to be blacked out. Okay, the question arises because we've previously seen, in 2011, for example, situations where memos, entire paragraphs would have been redacted, dealing with environmental issues at the time, I believe it was, and giving the policies and concerns of certain. Will this still occur under 58, under Bill C-58, to sort of redact almost the entirety of the memo? Well, C-58 has not modified the exemptions or the exclusions. The situation remains unchanged. I suppose that's a response. "30 seconds. Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Those that appear at committee today for your time today and answering our questions, and the meeting is adjourned.